Order, please. Before the daily routine, the subject matter has been chosen for late debate, and I will now read it. Therefore, be it resolved that due to the increasing losses of full-time jobs in the province, the NDP's job strategy should be renamed Part-Time Jobs Here. Submitted by the honourable member for Preston. Presenting and reading petitions, the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition with the operative clause. The petitioners call upon the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to use its powers over the Board of Commissioners of Public Utilities and the UARB to deny any general rate application presented by NSBI requesting a rate increase in 2013 and 2014. There are 100 signatures, and I'll affix my name, Mr. Speaker.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees, the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to table the Standing Committee on Human Resources on behalf of the Chair. I'd like to present that to the House.
The report is tabled. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. À une date ultérieure, je demeurera l'adoption de résolution suivante. Attends-tu qu'il y a important pour les néo-écossais de recevoir des soins de santé dans leur langue maternelle et dans la mesure du possible, et entendu que le Conseil communautaire du Grand Havre et le groupe médical Ravine ont travaillé avec diligence pour recruter un autre médecin francophone pour leur nouvelle clinique qui ouvrira sa porte en janvier. Et entendu que le docteur Veronica Lepage sera le nouveau médecin de la clinique et accepter dès maintenant l'inscription du nouveau patient. Par conséquent, il a que le membre de cette Assemblée félicitant le Dr Veronica Lepage, nouveau médecin du groupe médical Ravine, lui souhaite la bienvenue à Nouvelle-Écosse et félicitant pour son engagement à offrir des soins de santé améliorés aux néo-écossais francophones. Monsieur le Président, je demeurerai l'adoption de cette résolution sans priver, sans débat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas it's important for Nova Scotia to receive health care in their first language wherever possible, whereas le Conseil communautaire de Grand Havre et le groupe médical Ravine have worked diligently to recruit another francophone doctor to their new clinic opening in January. And whereas Dr. Veronica Lepage will be the new doctor at the clinic and is taking registration now for new francophone patients. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates Dr. Veronica Lepage on becoming the new doctor for the Groupe Médical Ravine, welcome her to Nova Scotia, and commend her commitment to providing better health care to francophone Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried.
No, I didn't.
Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Before I introduce this bill, I wonder if I would be permitted to make a few introductions.
Bill? Oh, certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to draw the House's attention to the East Gallery, where we are joined today by several special guests from the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. I would like to ask them to stand when I say their names. Mr. Mark Bursey is Chair of the Board of Governors of the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. Mr. Robbie Shaw is a member of the Board of Governors of the Art Gallery and chairs the board's Development Committee. And Mr. Ray Cronin is the Director of the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. All three gentlemen are well known in the arts community and are great supporters of the arts in general, but particularly of the Arts Gallery of Nova Scotia. And I'd like all members of the House to extend a warm greeting to them.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 22 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia Act.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 22 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia Act.
Bill number 127, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 22 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Support Students with Diabetes and Other Life-Threatening Illnesses.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Support Students with Diabetes and Other Life-Threatening Illnesses.
Bill number 128, entitled An Act to Support Students with Diabetes and Other Life-Threatening Illnesses.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce the following bill entitled An Act Respecting the Liverpool United Baptist Church Cemetery.
The Honourable Member for Queens begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Liverpool United Baptist Church Cemetery.
Bill number 129, entitled An Act Respecting the Liverpool United Baptist Church Cemetery.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce the following bill entitled An Act Respecting the Convention of Atlantic Baptist Churches.
The honourable member for Queens begs leave to introduce the bill entitled An Act Respecting the Convention of the Atlantic Baptist Churches.
Bill number 130, entitled An Act Respecting the Convention of Atlantic Baptist Churches.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the indulgence of the House, can we revert order to ministerial notice as a motion?
The motion has to revert back. Is everybody in favour? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable members for their indulgence. I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year since 1971, Nova Scotia sends Boston a large Christmas tree in gratitude for their help Bostonians provided after the devastating Halifax explosion of December the 6th, 1917. And whereas a beautiful 15-metre white spruce will be this year's gift from Nova Scotia to the American city as part of the yearly tradition now entering its 5th decade. And whereas this year's Nova Scotia tree for Boston was donated by Paul and Jan Hicks of Jordan Bay, Shelburne County, and the Minister of Fisheries attended that event this morning. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House express our thanks to the Hicks family for providing this year's remarkable tree to represent Nova Scotia's gratitude for the City of Boston. And Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Notices of motion. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on future days to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since 2008, food bank usage is up more than 38% in Nova Scotia, and whereas power rates have risen 25% under this government's watch. And whereas this NDP government agreed to hand over $590 million to 6 corporations, only to watch them lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians. $245 million of that went to Bowater and Port Hawkesbury Paper, companies that slashed wages, rolled back benefits, and left pensioners in the cold. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville still supports the Premier's inaction on power rates, and their failure to improve wages is hurting this province and the people in the riding of Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas students from Seton Elementary School in North Sydney were treated to locally grown food during a luncheon at Cape Breton Richmond Agricultural Federation in October under the watchful eye of manager Maureen Murphy. And whereas the school is also partnering with the Federation to grow its own garden in the spring, connecting the students with their food source. And whereas it's great to be able to introduce children to the wonders of growing your own food and give them a better understanding of how hard farmers work to grow our food. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Cape Breton Richmond Federation of Agriculture and their partnership with Seton Elementary School. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I bring forth my resolution, may I have permission for an introduction?
Most certainly.
Thank you very much. Today in our gallery, we have Kathy Oikel and her daughter, Carolyn Dominy. Kathy was diagnosed in April of 2011 with ALS, or more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Kathy has previously worked as a CCA for 20 years before her diagnosis, and after finding out that she had ALS, Kathy did not let that get her down. And with the help of her family and her friends, Kathy has embarked on a journey of education and awareness about ALS. And on September the 9th, Kathy was at the helm at Kings County's first walk for ALS. I would like the members of this House of Assembly to give Kathy and her daughter Carolyn a very warm welcome to our legislature.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kathleen Oikel of Colebrook was responsible for organizing and participating in the first walk for ALS ever to have taken place in the Annapolis Valley. And whereas the efforts put forth by Kathleen and those who supported her led to over $13,000 being donated to raise awareness and to fund research toward an eventual cure. And whereas Kathleen has shown a dedication throughout her life and in her career to those who need assistance the most. Therefore, be it recognized that all members of this House recognize the passion and dedication of this remarkable Nova Scotian. Congratulate her for an incredible fundraising effort despite living with ALS, and celebrate her remarkable contributions to ALS research and to a future with a cure. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas ongoing employment insurance investigations involving 11 fishing operations in northern Cape Breton has resulted in denial of benefits and ongoing undue hardship on the families living in Bay St. Lawrence. Whereas there's no greater sign of the impact of the investigations initiated by the federal Conservative government than the opening of the Bay St. Lawrence Food Bank to ensure residents are able to feed themselves and their families while they wait. Whereas families interviewed indicated that while they tried to find employment to support their families, they were unable to do so due to a lack of jobs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge that the actions of both the federal Conservatives and the provincial NDP is creating undue hardship for the residents of Bay St. Lawrence, and one needs to look no further for proof than the opening of yet another food bank in our province.
The motion is tabled. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October 13th, a ceremony commemorating the Cape Breton Highlanders was held at the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 53 in Baddeck, and whereas since their inception on October 13th, 1871, the Cape Breton Highlanders have distinguished themselves at home and on the battlefields of the world through the two great wars and in Korea. And whereas a cairn and plaque prepared and presented jointly by the County of Victoria, the Baddeck Village Commission, the Royal Canadian Legion, and the Cape Breton Highlanders was unveiled to honour the 141st anniversary of the Highlanders. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature join in recognising the 141st anniversary of the Cape Breton Highlanders and their distinguished service both in the past and present. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present this on behalf of the Honourable Premier. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the community of Cole Harbour has long been known for its strong sports teams and organizations, particularly its women's softball teams under the Cole Harbour Comets program. And whereas this season was another great year for the Comets, with the groups under 10, under 12, and under 14 teams finishing first in their respective provincial championships. And whereas the under-12 team, coached by Joe Fitzharris, went undefeated during the provincial tournament and pulled out a nail-biting win in the championship game, taking Stellarton an extra inning to win 8-7. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House thank all of the volunteers, coaches and parents who dedicate their time to our young athletes and congratulates all of the players of the Cole Harbour Comets under 10, under 12 and under 14 teams on an outstanding season and receiving top honours in the province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Soldier On Fund supports serving Canadian Forces personnel and also former personnel and families of ill and injured members, and whereas John Allen Sperry, a freelance graphic designer from Valley, Colchester North, designed the 3 original Toy Soldier action figures, the Heroes Force logo, the packaging of the dolls, and the tags included with the first 6,000 toys, and whereas Sperry and several other individuals in other parts of Canada were also involved in the action figure project and presented a check for $6,600 to representatives of the Soldier On Fund. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly congratulate and thank John Allen Sperry and all those involved with the design, production, and sale of the action figures, which will help provide for those who have volunteered so much for our country and our citizens. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there are 5,500 fewer full-time jobs in Nova Scotia today than there were 3 years ago. And whereas 6,100 jobs have disappeared from the South Shore since the NDP became government, and whereas the unemployment roll grew even larger with news of the Colony Restaurant and Chowder House will close its door in the new year. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly agree that the better way forward for our province is a balanced budget, lower taxes, power rates that fit with what consumers and business can afford, and labour laws that encourage investment and growth. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September 30th, 2012 marked the day the Country Harbour Community Centre and multi-purpose facility was officially opened. And whereas the site of the new Country Harbour Community Centre and multi-purpose facility is on the site of the old school, which has a strong local attachment. And whereas the community, along with funding through both local and government partners, erected a new community centre and playground facility for use by its residents and guests. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the residents of Country Harbour on the successful opening of the Country Harbour Community Centre and multi-purpose facility and wish them every success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in early October, Staff Sergeant Phil Barrett decided to retire after 41 years of service. And whereas, like all Mounties, Barrett's career began at the depot in Regina with posts in Ontario, British Columbia, the Yukon, and finally Digby, Nova Scotia. Whereas Barrett's career has also led him to spend 21 years in plain clothes, investigating major crimes, and even working with the U.S. Secret Service coordinating motorcade visits from Halifax. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Staff Sergeant Phil Barrett on his outstanding career and wish him many enjoyable retirement years ahead. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I request to do this resolution on behalf of the member for Cape Breton West. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the New York, New Jersey area was battered by Hurricane Sandy, 8.5 million people without power and tragically taking the lives of 100 people in 10 states. And whereas the storm damaged and destroyed the homes of thousands of families, and whereas the shortage of gas is hampering restoration efforts and causing rationing and long lines at service stations. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House Assembly urge all Nova Scotians to open their hearts and donate anything they can to hurricane relief efforts in the United States as our neighbours to the south begin to rebuild after the storm. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Creative Cuts in Cole Harbour, owned by Melinda O'Hearn, recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. And whereas Creative Cuts has become one of the most popular salons in the area, presently employing 8 stylists, 2 anestheticians, and 1 nail technician, making the small business a viable employer. And whereas Melinda began with modest beginnings and admirably developed this salon into a location serving a dedicated and growing clientele over the last 20 years. Therefore be it resolved that this Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates Melinda O'Hearn and her salon Creative Cuts in Cole Harbour for not only 20 years of service to the local small business community, but also providing a successful business example for others. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Paul Norwood, a resident of Lake Echo, has lived and worked in and around his community for all his life. Where he has donated countless hours of his time and equipment to Lake Echo Playground and has provided support in the community to many individuals. Whereas Paul was responsible for the milling of trees that were down from Hurricane Juan to use for a picnic shelter in the Lake Echo Playground, which he constructed by himself on his own time. Therefore resolved that members of this House join me in recognizing Paul Norwood's contribution to the community and especially to the children of Lake Echo. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on August 12th, the first Highland Fun Day drew 600 visitors to Margaree for the Highland Games, a fundraiser for St. Michael's Church. And whereas many volunteers, specifically Adele LeBlanc, Audrey LeBlanc, and Chris McDaniel, contributed to the success of the day through event planning, bake sales, dances, and children's activities. And whereas Father Doug McDonald, who has been a world-class competitor on the professional Highland Games circuit before his ordination, was happy to participate with top athletes from all over the Maritimes in this first Margaree Highland Games. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge the hard work and dedication put forth by all volunteers in organizing the 2012 Margaree Highland Games. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member for Truro Bible Hill, I'd like to read the following resolution. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Colchester Community Workshop first opened its doors in the 1960s and has undergone tremendous expansion and development since that time to now include services to approximately 70 adults with intellectual disabilities, teaching them life and employment skills. And whereas the Colchester Community Workshop, after a successful fundraising campaign, moved into the new Rotary House building in 2005, expanding programs to include the Intercolonial Cafe, a larger, new-to-use second-hand clothing store, making a total of 9 programs available for clients. And whereas the Colchester Community Workshop recently opened their newest venture, the Yonge Street Variety Store, and celebrated their official grand opening on October the 27th, 2012, providing a new range of employment opportunities for clients. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature thanks the Colchester Community Workshop for all of their hard work, the success of their programs, and on the grand opening of their most recent business venture, Yonge Street Variety. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas after nearly 2 years of planning, the Yarmouth Mariner Centre was the site of the World Junior A Challenge, which took place from November 5th to the 11th. And whereas teams from all over the world, including the Czech Republic, Russia, Switzerland, the United States, and from all over Canada, enjoyed the famous warmth and hospitality of Yarmouth and surrounding area. And whereas the tournament was called the best ever World Junior A Challenge by Hockey Canada Board Chair Mike Bruni, therefore, be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly recognize and thank the host committee, the countless volunteers, the management and staff of the Yarmouth Mariner Centre for their incredible hard work in putting together and hosting such a successful event and showcasing the hospitality of Yarmouth, which is receiving international praise. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Corey DeVoe placed 44th out of 2,500 competitors at the Ironman Mount Tremblant competition in Quebec. And whereas the 20-year-old Little Bador teacher has now qualified for the 34th annual Ironman World Championships in Hawaii, where only the top 1,800 athletes worldwide qualified to compete. And whereas Corey has been a member of the Cape Breton Barbarians Triathlon Group for the past 2 years and has come a very long way in this sport, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Corey DeVoe on his athletic achievement and wish him every success in Hawaii this fall. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the municipality of the District of Lunenburg is the third largest rural municipality in terms of total property assessment in the province of Nova Scotia. And whereas in October of this year, the municipality of the District of Lunenburg saw 25 people put their names forth in the municipal election, including Lee Noss of District 10 and Eric Histovet of District 12. And whereas the new council, consisting of mayor and 12 councillors, will represent the best interests of the residents of the municipality of the District of Lunenburg for the next 4 years. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulates Mayor Don Down and councillors Lee Noss and Eric Histovet on their election to the municipality of the District of Lunenburg Municipal Council. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Where Edith Rossiter was born and raised in Jollymore, Nova Scotia, and lived and worked in Halifax until 1975, when she and her family moved to Chesncook, Nova Scotia, while working at the Dartmouth Police, Department of Finance, and the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and where she was very involved within her community as well as the City of Dartmouth as she distributed food to various church organizations and Hope Cottage. And whereas in the mid-90s, the MLA for the area saw the need for a food bank in the community, and together they worked to organize what is known as the Chesncook Food Bank, which now supports over 70 families thanks in part to Feed Nova Scotia, generous donations from the public, and the churches and the local supermarket. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House recognize Edith Rossiter for the contribution she has made to her community. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Graham McKenzie, owner of Stone's Pharmacy in Benek, was recently presented the Takeda Magnum Opus Award 2012 for significant education in a particular area to further the pharmacist practice. And whereas the award recognized Graham's education to further his knowledge in nutraceutical, anti-aging and preventative therapies and much more, and whereas Graham was the Nova Scotia winner of the award, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize Graham McKenzie's achievement and thank him for his contribution to the betterment of the health of residents of Victoria County. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Margaret McLean, a library assistant at the River John Library in Pictou County, has received the Emile Theriault Library and Information Award from the Nova Scotia Library Association at their annual conference in September, and whereas this award is made to our library staff member who has made a significant contribution to her library community, and whereas Margaret McLean has worked at the River John Library and has helped many people with their reading and educational issues, as well as their information technology needs for 25 years. Therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulates Margaret McLean on receiving the Emile Theriault Library and Information Award from the Nova Scotia Library Association and thanks her for time and dedication to the River John Library and the River John community. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the village of Tatamagouche has opened its first ever food bank, and whereas the growth of food banks in our province is a sign of a poor economy coupled with intense cost pressures facing families and individuals in not only Tatamagouche but throughout Nova Scotia. And whereas the high cost of gasoline, seasonal unemployment, and the high number of minimum wage jobs were factors which contributed to the opening of the Tatamagouche Food Bank. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly acknowledge that the NDP's plan to fix the economy and make life more affordable for Nova Scotia families is not working, and no one needs to look further for proof than the opening of yet another food bank in our province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Now recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Monsieur le Président, date ultérieure, je demande l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que le 15 août 2012, lors de la messe de l'Assomption de la Vierge Marie à Saint-Anne-du-Ruisseau, une consécration très spéciale a eu lieu lorsque Monseigneur Gérald Leblanc a présidé la bénédiction de nouvelle orgue pour l'Église. Et attendu que Bernadette Armstrong de Tuscott, anciennement de Belleville, a fait le don généreux de l'orgue à l'Église Sainte-Anne en mémoire de son mari décédé, Paul Armstrong. Et attendu que Bernadette Armstrong est une enseignante à la retraite, une mère de 6 enfants qui a vécu dans la paroisse toute sa vie et s'est dévouée à sa famille d'Église, ayant fait partie de la chorale de l'Église, ainsi étant une directrice musicale des messes dominicales pendant les nombreuses années. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu que tous les membres de cette Assemblée félicitent l'Église Sainte-Anne pour avoir acquis leur nouvelle orgue, remercie Bernadette Armstrong pour son généreux don, son dévouement à sa paroisse et lui souhaite la bonne santé continue. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas on August 15, 2012, at the Mass of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in Saint-Anne-du-Ruisseau, a very special dedication took place when Monseigneur Gérald Leblanc presided over the blessing of a new organ for the church. And whereas Bernadette Armstrong of Tuscott, formerly of Belleville, generously donated the organ to St. Anne's Church in memory of her late husband, Paul Armstrong. And whereas Bernadette Armstrong is a retired school teacher, a mother of 6 children who has lived in the parish her whole life and dedicated herself to her church family, having been part of the church choir as well as musical director at Sunday Masses for many years. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate St. Anne's Church on acquiring their new organ and thank Bernadette Armstrong for her generous donation, her dedication to the parish, and her continued good health. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
I think that's her. Go ahead.
I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Walk to Cure Diabetes made a return to Lunenburg County on September 30th at the Mark and Day Spring, and whereas this fundraising goal this year was to raise $10,000, part of the Diabetes Foundation goal of raising $2,000 province-wide, whereas this year's walk ambassadors were Stephen Strum and Nathan Rechnitzer of Bridgewater, who helped the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation to meet their fundraising goal, with 85% of the funds going directly to the diabetes research. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognizes the Lunenburg County Walk to Cure Diabetes event held in Day Spring on September 30th and commend all volunteers and participants for their efforts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the under-18 Tier 2 girls Bedford Titans soccer team rose to the challenge of competition in the 2011-12 soccer season, garnering not 1 but 2 significant championship titles. And whereas throughout the 11-12 season, this team of young women juggled their individual responsibilities while learning as a team to cooperate, persist, and focus on their competitive goals, and are described by their coach, Mike McLean, as articulate, well-organized, and respectful. And whereas the U18 Tier 2 girls Bedford Titans soccer team first claimed the Capital Inter-District Soccer League title on August 18, 2012, beating out 7 other teams from HRM, and unwavering came back just 1 week later to take the Nova Scotia provincial title 3-2 over the Highland and Cape Breton Northern Nova Scotia Falcons. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate all members of the under-18 Tier 2 girls Bedford Titans soccer team on their victories, and their coach, Mike McLean, who believes these young women will one day apply the good character they have shown in competition to their chosen paths in life. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Clare organization representing persons with disabilities, CORD, launched the 2012 Camp Récréation summer camp this past summer, and whereas disabled youth from ages 15 to 19 that may have difficulty qualifying for other programs or may just not have an interest in other programs participated in the special summer camp pilot program, and whereas the community of Clare was exceptionally supportive of this special summer camp organized for disabled youth, therefore it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank Volunteer Coordinator Brenda Maya and Volunteer Assistant Coordinator Colleen Hicks for making sure that everyone who participated in the summer camp had fun and made sure that everyone was well taken care of, and wish them continued success in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since 2008, food bank usage is up more than 38% in Nova Scotia, and whereas power rates have risen 25% under this government's watch,
And whereas this NDP government agreed to hand over $590 million to 6 corporations, only to watch them lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians. $245 million of that went to Bowater and Port Hawkesbury Paper, companies that slashed wages, rolled back benefits, and left pensioners in the cold. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Halifax Fairview still supports the Premier's inaction on power rates, and their failure to improve wages is hurting this province and the people in the riding of Halifax Fairview. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption the following resolution. Whereas David Logie was appointed to the Western Regional Health Board in 1996, was appointed District Health Authority Chair for Annapolis and Kings County in 2000, and whereas David became engaged in the Corpus Sanchez Provincial Health Services operational review, which was reflective of his dedication to strengthen not only the Annapolis Valley District Health Authority, but our provincial system. And whereas David Logie served his community for 12 years in this important leadership role and constantly presented the need for human resources, more mental health and addiction services. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly express gratitude for Mr. Dave Logie's contribution to a healthcare system that is nationally recognized for its excellence. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many local volunteer firefighters provide a vital and outstanding service throughout rural Nova Scotia, and whereas Paul LeBlanc will be recognized for his dedication and service beyond the call of duty in helping preserve the security of our community, and whereas Paul LeBlanc will be recognized on November 24, 2012 by the Lillbrook Volunteer Fire Department for his 25 years of dedicated service. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate firefighter Paul LeBlanc for receiving the Fire Service Long Service Award for his 25 years of service to his community. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Main Street and Area Business Improvement District Association was incorporated in July 2008, and whereas the Main Street Business Improvement District Association has a mandate of working with all area businesses to raise the quality of experience for investors, business owners, residents, and visitors to the Main Street area, and whereas Grizelia Grabeck was recently appointed as the new Executive Director of the Main Street Business Improvement District, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Ms. Grizelia Grabeck on her new role in supporting businesses of Dartmouth's Main Street area. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Miles Creighton of Digby, Nova Scotia has captured his 3rd straight Player of the Year title from the Nova Scotia Golf Association. And whereas Miles walked away with this year's title after finishing the season with 197 points. And whereas highlights of Creighton's season included winning the Avon Valley Invitational, 3rd place finishes at Osborne Invitational, and the Sam Tebow. He also tied for 4th at the Abercrombie Invitational and the Subway Invitational at Kenwoe. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Miles Creighton for his exceptional achievements in the sport of golf and wish him all the best in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 11-year-old Maddie Ritzie of Bedford, who lost her grandfather to Alzheimer's, decided to take action to fight the disease, and whereas Maddie Ritzie has spent her spare time baking and selling muffins, cookies, and cupcakes in order to raise money for research into Alzheimer's disease, and whereas Maddie Ritzie, through her own motivation and generosity, raised $500 and even donated her birthday gift money to support the work of the Alzheimer's Society. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Maddie Ritzie for doing her part to contribute to a worthy cause. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May 17, 2012, the Canadian Lebanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry hosted the 5th annual Cedar and Maple Gala. And whereas MacDonnell Welding and Metalworking Limited, owned by Anthony Sala, was honoured at the event with the award for Outstanding Lebanese Company of the Year. And whereas, since buying the company in 1996, Anthony Sala has worked tirelessly to build the company up and has faced major challenges and successfully transformed the company into a construction firm. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Anthony Sala on receiving the Outstanding Lebanese Company of the Year Award for his successful company, MacDonnell Welding and Metalworking Limited. And I'll give it to you later because it's not written.
That could be tabled.
Later.
Just for waiver?
I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate. Thank you very much.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Joel Plaskett is a Lunenburg-born Dartmouth resident whose music with his band Emergency defies categorization by being folk, pop, and rock all at once. And whereas Mr. Plaskett, who immortalized the Dartmouth Ferry and song, owns his own independent record label, New Scotland Records. And whereas Mr. Plaskett recently purchased a property on Lower Portland Street where he plans to open a new recording studio. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Plaskett on the construction of his new studio and recognize him for his commitment to the downtown Dartmouth area he calls home. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
A request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:57. We will finish at 3:57. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has a bad habit of overpromising, overhyping, and under-delivering when it comes to job announcements. Mr. Speaker, we've heard this government say 500 jobs at DSTN, 11,000 at Irving, 2,000 at Bowater, 1,400 in Port Hawkesbury, 280 at Scanwood. Mr. Speaker, that's 15,180 jobs promised. And what have we got from those 5 deals, Mr. Speaker? More than 1,300 layoffs, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, 5 deals that were supposed to create 15,180 jobs have resulted in 1,300 pink slips. Why have so many government deals gone bad?
Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is fabricating some of the numbers. That's simply not true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week alone, we had all Nova Scotians had cause to celebrate. We created nearly 1,000 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's a reason for all Nova Scotians to be proud. The only ones that aren't proud are the job killers sitting on the opposite side of the House.
Order, please. I'd remind the honourable member that fabricating the numbers is a little bit questionable around unparliamentary, so I'd ask the honourable member to retract that, please. Fabricating.
I will take that back, Mr. Speaker, and I'll substitute simply not true.
Fine, that's fine. The honourable leader of the official opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, $590 million for 1,300 pink slips. Talk about job killers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are now more Nova Scotians unemployed than during the recession. We've lost more than 3,000 full-time jobs since the NDP have taken office. Youth unemployment, Mr. Speaker, is up 20%. The only comfort this government has offered to 46,200 unemployed Nova Scotians is that jobs will come soon. Mr. Speaker, people are getting tired of this government's pointing to tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, they are suffering today. So my question for the minister, why has the government's job strategy only created part-time jobs in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through the Leader of the Opposition's own admission, one of the problems when we had a Liberal government in the province of Nova Scotia was they did not plan for the future, Mr. Speaker. A huge difference between then and now. We are planning for the future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that future seems like writing big checks, no job guarantees, and a lot of part-time work, Mr. Speaker, for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, too many Nova Scotians are struggling to make ends meet. Our taxes are the highest in the country. The Premier says, elect me and I'll fix that. Mr. Speaker, our power rates are the highest in the country. The Premier says, elect me again and I'll fix that too. Our economy has, Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, the worst economic growth in Canada. And again, Mr. Speaker, the Premier says things will get better after the next election. This government's economic development strategy, Mr. Speaker, has failed, and Nova Scotians are suffering now, Mr. Speaker, today. So my question for the minister, when will the government admit jobs here is a failed strategy, and when will they go back to the drawing board?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can stand in my place and I can say this. Do you know who's failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker? I know who's failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and it's sitting on the opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today it's being reported that the government is considering buying up to 550,000 acres of woodlands. Woodlands that, as recently as June, had an estimated value of $120 million. That's $120 million that could end up in the pockets of Resolute Forest Products Limited, Mr. Speaker. And so my question to the Premier is a simple one. Where will the Premier find the money for such a large purchase?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out in the past, there are certainly negotiations going on with Resolute. The question that is before us is not where the money will come from, but what will happen to 550,000 acres of forest land in our province in southwest Nova Scotia. Now, perhaps it would be the desire of the members opposite to have that to fall into the hands of a foreign company and have it stripped out and sent off shore without processing. But if that is the desire of the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia, just let the people of Southwest Nova know.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we go again. Just like Muskrat Falls, where the Premier says the cost is not the issue. He now believes that $120 million purchase of land, the cost is not an issue either. Well, Mr. Speaker, for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, the cost of that land, just like Muskrat Falls, certainly is an issue for them. And like Muskrat Falls, the Premier is plunging down this expensive road without even considering the other options that are available to him. Right. Because we can all share the goal of protecting that land, of making sure it's available to future generations of Nova Scotians, of making sure it's used in a responsible way. Purchasing is not the only option. There are many other ways of accomplishing that same objective that don't require another $100 million of debt. And so my question to the Premier is, has he looked at other options for accomplishing that same objective that don't involve adding another $100 million to our debt, and will he table them in the House today if he has?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, there have been a full examination of the assets of the company, including, as I said, the 550,000 acres of Nova Scotia woodlands that would be up for sale to a foreign company, and who then would be hostage to whoever that potential purchaser might be. And this, in fact, has been the way that things have been done in the past, Mr. Speaker. And I say to the House of Assembly, I say to the people of Southwest Nova Scotia, I say to Nova Scotians that we are sick and tired of watching the future of Nova Scotia being sold off to foreign interests, and that day is over.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians are sick and tired of is a government that thinks the answer to every problem is to write a gigantic, great, big check with their money. That is what they are sick and tired of. And they're also sick and tired of a Premier who commits them to massive expenditures of money without looking at all his options. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is in this House of Assembly, we can decide to put that land to its highest and best use for all Nova Scotians without writing a big check. And so my question to the Premier is, will he look at the other options and bring them here for all Nova Scotians to see, instead of give another $100 million to Resolute Forest Products?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the Leader of the Conservative Party that land, not only is it a resource that will generate would generate every year stumpage, not only is it land that will be used for recreation for generations of Nova Scotians to come, but, Mr. Speaker, it is also about the future of the forestry sector. Now, back on August 27th, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table this. The Leader of the Conservative Party, in an interview with CKBW, said 500,000 acres of prime Acadian forests are up for sale, and the government has no plan for that. I am one of those people that believes it would be a real shame if all of that land were to fall into the foreign hands who have no interest in the long-term sustainability for our province, for our forests, Mr. Speaker. We thought we knew where he stood, but apparently we don't.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government signed a deal with Project, Mr. Speaker, to subsidize one business in a successful industry. The government promised this would create 440 jobs over 5 years. Mr. Speaker, we've heard this before. The government promised 500 jobs over 5 years with DSTN. This government committed up to $11.4 million in payroll rebates, Mr. Speaker, to this company. What is not clear is if the company will receive rebates for employees poached from other Nova Scotia businesses. So my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, a job poached is not a job created. Will projects receive a payroll rebate for employees taken from other Nova Scotia employers?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for years, we've stood in this House and we've heard complaints about out-migration. We've heard, even when we were in opposition, we had some concerns about out-migration. Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity here with projects. This was a Calgary-based firm. Mr. Speaker, what we are simply doing is the reverse of a trend that was employed by previous governments. We are bringing Calgary to Halifax, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, just let me... Mr. Speaker, I wonder if he believes what they write for him, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to believe at some point with some of the stuff that comes out of that minister, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is wading into a thriving industry to grab headlines without considering the impacts, Mr. Speaker. Even in tough economic times, this industry has grown, and companies that already had a presence in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, are growing. The government picked one company, Mr. Speaker, over all of them. This government is trying to pick winners and losers without consulting the industry. So my question for the minister, why did this government give $11.6 million to one company in an already thriving industry without consulting those in other players?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this idea that we've got Calgary finally coming to Nova Scotia is going to give an opportunity for those Nova Scotians that are graduating from our universities to stay right here in the province of Nova Scotia. Also, Mr. Speaker, it's going to give an opportunity for those Nova Scotians that are out west to come back home, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Chamber of Commerces promote this activity. Mr. Speaker, and I've got to say, and someone in this House doesn't understand it, and those individuals aren't sitting on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, payroll rebates are paid in arrears. They are paid out as job numbers are achieved, Mr. Speaker. This is a way of doing business. We've done business for the good citizens of the province of Nova Scotia. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, we have to go around and fix some of the things that leader over there is trying to undo.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I hope those graduates that the minister is referring to aren't like those employees that he promised jobs at DSTN, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope they're not like the 1,400 people in the Strait area that were looking for work that this government promised, Mr. Speaker, which is evaporating, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope they're not like the 500 people in the South Shore, Mr. Speaker, whose jobs actually, Mr. Speaker, not only vanished, but Nova Scotia taxpayers' dollars went to Quebec, Mr. Speaker, to invest in a paper mill. That's what Nova Scotians are getting from this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and now, Mr. Speaker, what we have, Mr. Speaker, is a government taking tax dollars out of Nova Scotia companies and handing it over to a company from Calgary to compete directly against them for employment, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of economic development we have out of this, Speaker. Think about that for a second, Mr. Speaker. Hard-working Nova Scotians who've been building an industry, building an economy in the province of Nova Scotia, have their government turn around, take their tax dollars and give it to a firm in Calgary to compete directly against them, to take their employees, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, those aren't jobs being created, Mr. Speaker. Those aren't jobs being created, Mr. Speaker. Those are jobs being poached from hard-working Nova Scotia firms, Mr. Speaker. My question, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, why would the minister be so eager to invest in a Calgary firm instead of supporting hard-working Nova Scotia entrepreneurs?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this government is about creating jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I know, Mr. Speaker, that may be a foreign concept to members on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, I will read, and I'm going to table this.
Thank you.
And this is written by Scott Richards, who is president at Atlantic Region Projects. And I'm going to quote, Mr. Speaker, if I may. Not one employee of Projects left their previous employer based on government support of Projects, because there hasn't been any government support in our first operation here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to table this, and what this does is this outlines a company a company who believes in Nova Scotia, a company from Calgary believes in Nova Scotia, unlike, Mr. Speaker, those members over there.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government says its deal with IBM will bring hundreds of good-paying jobs to Nova Scotia, and certainly we've heard that before. Governments in Queensland, New York, and Iowa have heard that as well, Mr. Speaker. In fact, IBM has a history of taking government money and failing to meet job targets. My question for the Economic Development Minister: why did this government sign a deal to make job promises with a company that has such a poor track record of meeting its obligations?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the opposition doesn't understand, Mr. Speaker, which we understand fully and Nova Scotians understand, with a company like IBM coming to the province of Nova Scotia is going to attract other companies. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand. I can't understand for the life of me why somebody would be against a progressive company. 500 jobs, Mr. Speaker. 500 jobs. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, it means a heck of a lot to Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the minister that any single corporation of these large corporations that we've given money to, they'll all return and come to Nova Scotia for $100 million of taxpayers' money any day of the week. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, IBM does have a history of serious cost overruns. A deal between London's Driving Vehicle Licensing Agency and IBM promised $57 million in savings, Mr. Speaker. Instead, it saw overruns to the tune of $81 million. Given this government's program cuts and increasing deficit, we certainly cannot afford such a fiasco. The government already cut $65 million from education and $100 million from universities. So my question to the minister: what measures are part of the deal with IBM to recoup such cost overruns so students in Nova Scotia don't pay for the mistakes of the world's 9th largest corporation?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, it's hard when you're asked questions and people just can't grasp can't grasp it. They don't understand, Mr. Speaker. Payroll rebates are paid in arrears. Once you reach the milestone, as it's recognized, it's done. It's done by an external audit, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things, these 500 jobs, these 500 IT jobs, which is a growing sector here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, which will provide employment for new graduates, for recent graduates from our institutions, Mr. Speaker. I can't for the life of me understand why the Liberal Party would be complaining about these jobs. Jobs for good Nova Scotians so they can stay here in Nova Scotia, so they can come back home to Nova Scotia, so they can raise their families here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. 500 jobs.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This contract, of course, was untendered, so we don't even know what kind of investigation was done before this decision was made. If the government had investigated, Mr. Speaker, it would have learned of the Queensland experience. Queensland decided to use IBM to create a new payroll platform involving SAP. The result? The agreement has been called a debacle, and it will cost at least $1.2 million or more to repair the faulty system by 2017. So my question to the minister: when it comes to time to pay for these cost overruns, who will the government side with? Students and their families, or the 9th largest corporation in the world?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll break this down and make it a little bit more simple. With IBM, what we're going to have now, just listen up now. Now, what you have is you've got $50 million in payrolls. Do you know what that means to Nova Scotia? Do you know what that means? It's going to mean not only more jobs, not only more Nova Scotians staying here, Mr. Speaker, it's going to mean more money for education. It's going to mean more money for health. It's going to be more money for our roads. It's going to be more money for community services. Mr. Speaker, this is a sensible thing to do, but only a government with a vision would realize that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years since that bunch has been in, 7,400 Nova Scotians have lost their full-time jobs. And in the interest of accuracy, I will table the report from Statistics Canada that shows just that, 7,400 fewer full-time jobs. Mr. Speaker, during that same 3 years in the rest of Canada, the number of full-time jobs has increased by 688,400. Rest of Canada up 688,400. I'll table that in the interest of accuracy here in this House, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, spending $500 million on corporate welfare is not working for job creation in Nova Scotia when jobs here go down while jobs go up in the rest of the country. My question to the Minister of Economic Development, will he now abandon his corporate welfare spending spree since it is so clearly not working?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't so pathetic, it would be laughable. The simple fact of the matter is that the program, Nova Scotia Business Inc., which of course was instituted originally through the Conservative government of Dr. Ham, who has over the years operated to work to recruit business into the province. And in fact, I would point out to the leader of the Conservative Party, a company like RIM, which came to Nova Scotia. We're very happy to have them, 500 jobs. Simple fact of the matter is that they have had less people working now, but what that means is that they recover less in the way of payroll rebates because the jobs are actually tied to the rebates are actually tied to the jobs, and this means that these companies are essentially paid out of the money that they pay in payroll. So they get some of their own money back, and the balance of that goes to the people of Nova Scotia, as was pointed out by the Minister of Economic Development. It goes into new roads, it goes into payments for community services, it goes into health care, and it goes into education. Some of the $90 million that we have put into student assistance in the last number of years.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary. First.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am interested in the Premier's answer. I'm just not sure whose question he was answering, because that had nothing to do with my question to the Minister of Development about why 7,400 full-time jobs have disappeared in Nova Scotia, while the rest of Canada has been going up in full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. But that's not, of course, the end of the story. 2011 was one of the worst years in Nova Scotia history for out-migration. Worst year, in fact, in at least the last 25. At the same time, our economy, our GDP, went from the third best in the country when the NDP came in to one of the worst in the country, and I will table that report from Statistics Canada, again, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of accuracy. It appears that the only mess the NDP are trying to clean up is one of their own making. And so my question to the minister, or whoever over there wants to try and answer to it, is will they now, in the light of this evidence, stop their expensive corporate welfare spending spree and actually get on with the job of creating a few jobs in the province?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just so we understand, the Leader of the Conservative Party is dead wrong on all of those counts. First of all, there are 7,600 more jobs in Nova Scotia today than there were at the pre-recession peak, Mr. Speaker. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the worst years for out-migration in this province's history were 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, when the Progressive Conservative Party were in charge of the province. Fortunately, Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we have put an end to that.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apparently it's unparliamentary to say that someone is making something up, but perhaps it's not unparliamentary to actually invent your own statistics when you're answering a question, Mr. Speaker, because that is what we have just seen happen in this House. But I will go on, Mr. Speaker, because in addition to the job losses, which are measured by Statistics Canada, and in addition to the out-migration, which is measured by Statistics Canada, I happen to have the report on Nova Scotia's exports over the last 3 years, and guess what? They are down the most in all of Canada, over 16%, whether it's natural gas, whether it's lobsters, whether it's paper, whether it's anything else. The worst performance in the country, and I will table that report, and I hope the Premier takes the time to look at what Statistics Canada has to say about this province at some point. My final question to the Minister, or whoever over there wants to answer it, is will they now, in light of all this evidence, stop the expensive corporate welfare spending spree and get on with the job of actually creating a few jobs in Nova Scotia today? Thank you.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that rebates come out of the money that's actually paid by the company to us. They receive some of that back. That is, and maybe I need to explain the meaning of the word rebate to the Leader of the Conservative Party, but that's what a rebate is, Mr. Speaker. Simple fact of the matter is 7,600 more jobs in this province than there was at the pre-recession peak. And the other fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party left us with a $375 million deficit. Even the auditors afterwards said that that was on track for a $1.4 billion deficit if we continued down the track that the Tories were on. Mr. Speaker, their complaint is that we haven't cleaned up their mess fast enough.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. IBM just has a poor performance record similar to this government. Also, it has a habit of making deals behind closed doors. On March 19th, 2012, the UK Observer reported that the British government and IBM agreed to change their initial agreement governing the control of personal, confidential information, Mr. Speaker. Both parties agreed, and in such, let personal confidential information be stored offshore. My question for the Economic Development Minister, with IBM's pass, how can we be sure that this government will keep our personal confidential information safe?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have the utmost confidence in IBM. Mr. Speaker, IBM is sworn by confidentiality. We have no concerns. We are proud. We are proud that we were able to form a partnership with IBM. Mr. Speaker, IBM could have chose to be anywheres in the world. Anywheres in the world. They could be in India. They could be somewheres in the U.S. They could be in other jurisdictions. They chose Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and this government is proud of that.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only does sending this data offshore put security at risk, it also puts jobs at risk. UK Labour MP John McDonnell said, quote, UK Labour MP John McDonnell said, quote, despite all past promises by this government, the decision to offshore this sensitive information database will not only cost jobs, but open up vast opportunities for fraud, and end quote. We've signed a deal that does open vast opportunities for fraud and puts Nova Scotian jobs at risk. So my question to the Minister, how does the agreement with IBM ensure our data and Nova Scotian jobs will be safe and secure?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I will table this as well. Personal information protections with respect to provincial SAP services. Security features either reflect the province's current practices or enhance them. No personal information will leave Nova Scotia. It will remain on the servers that the province will continue to own and operate in its data center. The province determines what is considered. The province determines what is considered personal information. Such, for an example, addresses, banking information, social insurance numbers, etc. Any other data that may be shared for testing or quality assurance will be masked to protect personal and identifying information. Mr. Speaker, I will table that. Thank you.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question on this issue is about IBM changing the deal after the original deal is struck. Guarantees that the data will not be sent offshore. Guarantee that the jobs will not be sent offshore. Guarantee that this government will not enter into secret deals with IBM after the deal is signed. So again, I'll ask the minister, will he guarantee that our information is safe and secure and Nova Scotians can count on our government standing up for the people and making sure the information is protected?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
What I will guarantee, Mr. Speaker, is that the protection of information will be the same, if not better, than what we currently have, Mr. Speaker. That's what I guarantee.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, 8,200 Nova Scotians between the ages of 15 and 24 have lost full-time employment since October of 2009. That's close to the same as the population of Sydney Mines. The loss of full-time employment for young men and women in Nova Scotia is almost 5 times the national average. Nova Scotians, of course, deserve better. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is, will the minister admit his Jobs Where plan has failed young Nova Scotians, or will he continue to force our best and brightest to move away to make a decent living?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our track record will show that we are creating employment for Nova Scotians. We are creating an environment that will keep Nova Scotians here. Those recent graduates, with what we are doing, will not have to leave the province of Nova Scotia to go for employment in other jurisdictions around North America and around the world, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 7,600 new jobs have been created in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Jobs Here strategy is working. We've proven that. Over 1,000, nearly 1,000 jobs last week alone, one of the most productive weeks in Nova Scotian history, Mr. Speaker. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, 11,500 jobs that will be created at the peak of the urban shipbuilding, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Total employment, full-time and part-time, for Nova Scotians aged 15 to 24 has dropped 9%. That's 9 times the national average. Meanwhile, 3,800 young Nova Scotians have left the labour force in the last 3 years. We are losing our young people because this NDP government, their failure to create jobs. Yesterday, or the other day, the minister stood on his feet and said it was a pleasure for him to boast about the things his government has done with respect to employment. Again, Nova Scotians deserve better. So my question to the minister, what will the minister tell the 8,200 young Nova Scotians who lost a full-time job, or the 3,800 young people who have left the as to why they cannot find a job?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I can remember 3 years ago when we first came into power, in the shape that this province was in. Mr. Speaker, there are more people working today than there were when we took over government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a strategy. Our strategy is working, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we need and what we should have for the benefit of all Nova Scotians is have that party over there get on board.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
So again, while we're talking about stats, Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate for young men ages 15 to 24 in Nova Scotia has gone up by 41.4% since October of 2009. Let me repeat, that's gone up by 41.4%. Unemployment for this age category is dropping in the rest of the country, but it's gone up 41.4% here in Nova Scotia. These young men are saving for college, finding their first career, are in the prime age for putting down roots here, but their unemployment rate has gone up by 41.4% under this government's watch. Nova Scotians deserve better. My question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, will the minister finally admit his plan has failed young Nova Scotians and that a 41% increase in the unemployment rate for young men is totally unacceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand the rationale here. Here we are, last year we made this big announcement of nearly 1,000 jobs for Nova Scotians, and many of those jobs are going to be filled by young people. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, during the Liberal and the Conservative reign, 20 years, Nova Scotia was in what place? What place was Nova Scotia in 20 years? They were last, Mr. Speaker, dead last. We've taken that and we've turned the corner. We've turned the ship around, Mr. Speaker, something that they couldn't do in 20 years.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, almost a year ago, this NDP government offered up $90 million to Resolute. The Premier handed this money over to a corporation who in turn closed up shop and laid off Nova Scotians. This deal was no different than any of the other corporate handouts that the NDP have been so fond of. One of the most concerning aspects is the complete lack of transparency around this deal and subsequent deals to come. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Economic Development Minister is, when will the minister be upfront with Nova Scotians and start opening the books on his multi-million-dollar deals?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. This government is more upfront than any other previous governments. We didn't sell Nova Scotia taxpayers on P3 schools, Mr. Speaker. That wasn't this government that has sold taxpayers on P3 schools. A problem that we've yet to see come to fruition. But when it does, Mr. Speaker, the debt that we've inherited as a result of P3s. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't this government that sold Nova Scotia Light and Power, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't this government that did all those silly things. We've got a plan, Mr. Speaker. Our plan is proven. I don't know how anyone can stand in this House, Mr. Speaker, and criticize a government for looking out for the future of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's easy to criticize this government on its lack of transparency, and that's what I'm trying to do right now. The NDP government has a track record of handing over hundreds of millions of dollars to large corporations without handing over any details of these contracts. It is essential that the terms and conditions of the large corporate deals that the NDP keep making be made known so that they can be debated in this House. Instead, there is a veil of secrecy over everything that the NDP government does. The Bowater deal was no different, and Nova Scotians have low expectations when it comes to transparency on the impending Resolute land deal to follow. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, why does the NDP government insist on signing multi-million-dollar deals without giving Nova Scotians the proper information and details?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, payroll rebates, once they are done, they're there for the public to look at. What we don't do, Mr. Speaker, and no government previous to us, we don't negotiate deals with the corporate community in public. Those are done behind doors. Once those deals are done, they're open. Once they're done, they become part of the public record. Mr. Speaker, we've stood here session after session, and explained this to all honourable members of this House. Some people just refuse to understand it.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are watching their tax dollars leave this province. We saw it with the Resolute deal, and we're watching it happen again with DSME Trenton. What we've learned from the Bowater deal and what we've learned from the NDP is that the devil is in the details, and Nova Scotia taxpayers are too often left holding the bag. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, when will Nova Scotians see the NDP live up to the level of openness and transparency that they repeatedly,
after the next election, right?
Mr. Speaker, that they repeatedly called for when they were in opposition?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that reasoning is just not sound. You know, what we've done and what we do is we create jobs for Nova Scotians. We create employment, Mr. Speaker. They are going to get a salary. They're going to be paid a salary that's going to be spent. That's going to be spent here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. More tax revenue for the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not rocket science. However, they fail to understand it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, last week in this House, the Minister of ERDT said, Mr. Speaker, it's certainly a pleasure for me to rise on my feet and I could spend the rest of question period boasting about the good things this government has done when it comes to employment for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, not only is that insulting, Mr. Speaker, not only is that insulting, but it's offensive and it's blatantly incorrect. Nova Scotians deserve an economic development minister who will admit when he's wrong, and more importantly, a minister who knows what he's doing. And Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the minister finally admit things are going in the wrong direction under his watch and admit there's nothing to boast about in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Do you know, Mr. Speaker, I could stand here and I could tell you all of the offensive things that I've heard from that member coming from the opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. You know, the member doesn't understand about the investments that we made and Bill did it. He doesn't know, doesn't recognize the PIP, the Productivity Investment Program, Mr. Speaker, that we've made investments in every corner of the province of Nova Scotia. Good investments, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, investments that are paying off. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's shameful that that the third party, after what they did to the province of Nova Scotia, would get up on their seat and hurl insults around such as that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Speaker, last week this minister said, this government has protected jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. Yet Cape Breton has an unemployment rate of 16.4%. That's 16.4% unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker. The second highest unemployment rate in all regions of this country. With a protector like that, who needs enemies? Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit today that his protection is driving up unemployment in Cape Breton, and will he admit he's just not up to the job?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government knows full well where it stood with respect to New Page. Mr. Speaker, we were the first ones there. 1,400 jobs that we protected in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. 1,400 jobs, Mr. Speaker, that we made investments in so that they could stay here, Mr. Speaker, raise their families here, Mr. Speaker, and have a good quality of life. Mr. Speaker, not to mention Teltec, another company that this government has invested in. Bill did it. Mr. Speaker, there are countless companies in not only in mainland Nova Scotia, but certainly in Cape Breton that we've invested in because we believe in Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know where the third party was when it came to New Page, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Premier said job growth is going in the right direction. When comparing October 2009 to October 2012, Cape Breton's employment rate has decreased. Employment decreased by 1,800 jobs, approximately 500 full-time jobs lost, and approximately 1,200 part-time jobs lost. Mr. Speaker, if job growth is going in the right direction, which direction does the minister think is right?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one thing I do know for sure is that Nova Scotia is the leading province in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to opportunities and job creation. We are #1.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think Nova Scotians, my question's for the Minister of Natural Resources, and I think people can be forgiven if they're a bit suspicious when the government says there's a good deal coming with respect to Resolute or Bowater. I think we all remember the postcard the Premier and the member for Queen sent out that said a 5-year deal brightens prospects on the South Shore, enhance the long-term sustainability of the paper mill. You know, protecting 2,000 jobs, good job. We've spoken to a number of people who are still waiting for the apology for that one. You know, Mr. Speaker, last week the member for Queens introduced the late debate topic about the expected sale of the timberlands, and yet the fact is, Mr. Speaker, the government wouldn't provide any details so that the parties could actually debate and discuss that. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Natural Resources please tell us when this expected deal will be announced and whether he plans to bring it before the House so it can be properly examined?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Certainly the Bowater situation is very important to this province, and we've been in good faith negotiations with Resolute, and in addition to that, we spent considerable time on the South Shore consulting with sawmillers and woodlot owners and workers, environmental groups, MTRI, a whole lot of very important people there in the South Shore. And we're there to protect good jobs, to move forward with new and innovative ways to do forestry in this province, and ensure that workers and their families can remain and prosper here in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister just stood and said that they're still going through good faith negotiations, yet the member last week from Queens stood and said that this is a great deal, so either the deal is done and it can be tabled before the House, or the member misled the House last week by suggesting that it's a good deal, because unless the deal is done, you can't know if it's good or bad. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why he can't release the details of the deal now if his colleague already seems to know enough to argue that it's a good deal?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as I mentioned, we are in good faith negotiations with Resolute, and we're looking at all possible options for the assets of that company, and including the 550,000 acres. We're looking to moving forward, to support the forest industry, to support other wildlife and recreational needs. Really the needs of the community and the workers, and in due course, the details will be made available.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the minister saying due course the details will be released. We read reports today it might be around Christmas, kind of the way the boundary review was done as a Trojan horse around Christmas. You know, Mr. Speaker, last week the member for Queens stood and said it's a good deal. The minister now says, well, we're looking at all possibilities and we're negotiating in good faith. Mr. Speaker, this is a bit confusing that one member says it's a good deal, suggesting it's done, and the other member says they haven't finished it, so he doesn't know. Well, so Mr. Speaker, let's make this simple. Will the minister commit to the House that he will release the deal with Resolute Forest Products in full well before the legislature rises so it can be examined by the legislature?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It takes time to get things right. I just would ask for the honourable member to have patience, and again, we're working to get the best possible deal for Nova Scotians, for the workers and their families and the communities along the South Shore. 2,000 workers, and the spin-off will be of real great benefit to all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to a question on November 6th to the Minister of Education regarding the number of students in our schools who have identified special needs, the Minister responded, and I will quote and table, "The information that is being requested is information that I will need to ask the boards to supply to the Department of Education." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, we know the information is already available at the department, and it's appalling to think that this minister does not know that. So my question to the minister, will the minister table the information today?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I always find it confusing when a question is asked that the honourable member knows the answer to already. She is very well aware, Mr. Speaker, that the information for specific, well, we live in Nova Scotia and we don't label our children with specific needs within our school system. I can say how many children are IPPs or have modifications, but we don't track exactly children with special needs. They do that in the United States. We don't do that here in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I find it a bit strange to think that that's language that the minister doesn't want to use. However, she talks about funding for special needs children, so I'm confused. Mr. Speaker, all school boards were asked to complete a survey regarding students in their schools with identified special needs, and that came from the Department of Education, of which this minister is responsible. And that survey included students with IPPs, students on resource, students in learning centres, students receiving special services through speech-language pathologists and school psychologists. And, Mr. Speaker, the deadline for that survey to be completed and returned back to the department was June of 2012. That's 5 full months ago. So obviously, Mr. Speaker, the minister hasn't reviewed the information that she asked for 5 months ago. So my question to the minister is this: how can parents, students and teachers have any confidence that the minister understands the needs of their students when she has admitted she doesn't even know the information was requested and she hasn't been able to table it, and it's been there 5 months?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have been listening to parents and to school boards about funding for students in our schools that have specific needs. We listen very carefully, and in our budget, we increased that protected budget line by $13 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister doesn't seem to know the information that she asked for. She doesn't know if it's been submitted. She didn't know what the numbers were, and obviously hasn't been able to use them for future planning. The minister talks about more funding to special needs students, and I applaud the government for that. I would also, however, ask the minister, how can you build a budget to provide services and supports for students when you don't even know how many people you're planning for?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member would know that we work very closely with school boards, and they present us with the needs that they need each year, and we put that in our budget. And we actually listen to our school boards and to our parents and respond appropriately. Unlike when I was in education, and I think the honourable member would remember this. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to speak. I'm having some trouble hearing here. When I was a teacher and the honourable member was a teacher, she remembers very clearly that when the Liberals were in power, that they actually broke our collective agreement, rolled us back by 3% over a 3-year period. And talking about students and students with special needs, they sent teachers home for 5 days. And when the teachers were home, the children did not get the education they needed and deserved.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. This government refuses to take action on the use of ankle bracelets for patients on unescorted leave from the East Coast Forensic Hospital. Despite pleas from victims' families, they will not even consider it. They will keep them waiting. We do not believe this is a responsible approach for the government to take. My question, what assurance has the minister given the family of Raymond Tavel that he has given their suggestions serious consideration?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I see that the Conservative Party is trying to play in the plight of a family that is suffering from a very grievous loss. And I want to assure the party, the third party there, that I have read the documents, that I've heard their concerns. I've also looked at the 18 recommendations that the committee has put forward that did the analysis on the matters surrounding the forensic hospital and the sudden death that occurred, and that we're taking those seriously and moving them forward. What the Conservative Party would like to do is treat mental illness as though it is a crime, and that in itself is a crime.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister will remember that our difficulty with the 18 recommendations in the report is that there was no focus on public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has kept people waiting on every level. Thousands of people are waiting for full-time employment. They're waiting for lower power bills. They're waiting for long-term care and surgeries. The family of Raymond Tavel has made a very legitimate and heartfelt plea to the government. They do not deserve to be ignored. Keeping people safe should be a priority of any government. My question to the minister, why won't the minister listen to those who have been affected by his inaction and examine the use of ankle bracelets to protect both patients and the public?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you. Unlike the member that's raising the question, I spent a lifetime in public safety and take the matter very seriously. I put my career there. In addition, this government takes public safety seriously. And I'm very proud to say that I have the utmost confidence in the court system and to the judiciary, unlike the Conservatives that allude that they do not know how to make sound judgments as to who should or shouldn't receive ankle bracelets. I, too, have respect for our probation officers and our correctional service officers who provide a high-quality service, unlike the Conservative Party, who do not trust their judgment. I, too, respect the police officer and the frontline workers. They do great work, and I just wish the Conservative Party would give them the respect that they deserve.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, it's funny how times change. I spoke to a lot of law enforcement officers who really appreciated the Boots on the Street program. But when this former police officer becomes a Minister of Justice, what does he do? He cuts that program. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of law enforcement officers across this province that told me they did not appreciate that. They talked about the good work that that program did right in the schools, getting police officers into the schools to help young people, especially young people at risk. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think I'm running out of time. I think I've made my point, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The time allotted for questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Okay. Thank you. You want to do an introduction first before I do? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I'm calling government bills for second reading.
Government bills for second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 119, the Cosmetology Act?
Bill number 119, the Cosmetology Act. I'm now going to recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to draw the attention of the host to the West Gallery. Mr. Speaker, we have with us today members of the Pictou County Injured Workers Association who were holding an information picket outside coming across when members were coming into the House, Mr. Speaker, and they're asking government to hold a royal commission, Mr. Speaker, into WCB. And I'd like to recognize them, acknowledge them, and read their names off and ask them to stand and receive a warm welcome from the host. So there's Denise. They are Denise McKenzie, Larry Maloney, Daniel Stewart, Mary Lloyd, Candy Hubley, Valerie Stewart, and Wes McLean. I ask the members to give them a warm welcome.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on another introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for that. Mr. Speaker, I just want to draw the attention of the host to the West Gallery again, where we have Matthew Gall with us. Matthew is a student at St. Mary's University. He's from my constituency in Middleton. He's here observing what's going on in the House. He has a keen interest in politics, and I'm sure he's taking special note to what all the pages are doing here on the floor of the legislature. Perhaps we may see him here someday in the future, but I ask the host to give him a warm welcome here today.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of Bill 119, the Cosmetology Act, which was last reviewed 8 years ago. In Nova Scotia, 9,200 cosmetologists, 2,400 salons, 17 schools, and 600 students are licensed or registered to provide services such as hairdressing, skin care, and nails. Under the Act, the industry is managed by the Cosmetology Association of Nova Scotia, a self-governing body, and that is not changing. The Cosmetology Association of Nova Scotia establishes standards of practice for various areas of the profession and inspects workplaces to see those standards are followed. By regulating the industry, the province ensures cosmetologists are properly trained and their customers know that they are being served in a safe and clean environment. These proposed amendments, Mr. Speaker, which come at the request of the Cosmetology Association, modernize the Act to reflect changes that have arisen in this trade over the years. The proposed changes would allow the Cosmetology Association to establish licenses for specific areas of practice, such as facials. Until now, one had to be competent in all areas of cosmetology, even if they only intended to practice in one area of the industry. Through this bill, Mr. Speaker, we are responding to the needs of an industry that is seeing more specialization. Under the current Act, someone would enter the profession as a junior cosmetologist and practice under a master cosmetologist. Nova Scotia is the only province in Canada to have a two-tiered classification, Mr. Speaker, which makes it difficult for cosmetologists to relocate here from other provinces. As well, junior cosmetologists sometimes had difficulty finding a master cosmetologist in rural communities, which made it harder for them to find work locally. This bill would eliminate the junior